In the winter of 1944, a 15-year-old girl was eating tulip bulbs, not as a curiosity, not as a wartime novelty that she would describe later with the specific, rueful charm of someone who had endured something difficult and come out the other side of it intact, because there was nothing else. Her name was Audrey Hepburn, or rather, she was not yet Audrey Hepburn. She was Adriantje, a Dutch girl living in the village of Velp, near Arnhem, in a Netherlands that had been under Nazi occupation since 1940. The winter of 1944 was what the Dutch would come to call the Honger Winter, the Hunger Winter. The Germans had cut off food supplies to the Western Netherlands in retaliation for a railway strike. 18,000 people would die of starvation before it was over. The survivors, the people who made it to April 1945 when the Allied forces finally came, made it on grass and water and tulip bulbs ground into flour. Adriantje was 15 years old. She was severely malnourished. She could not sit properly. Her joints were swollen with starvation edema. Her eyes were sunken. She had gone as long as 3 days without food. She described that winter years later, in interviews that people received with the polite attention we extend to stories that happened long ago and far away, with these words: "We had no light, no heat, no water. We had no food because all the shops were closed. During the day, we merely existed." Now hold that girl in your mind. The swollen joints, the sunken eyes, the tulip bulb flower, the merely existing. Because 12 years later, in 1956, that same girl would be on the cover of every magazine in the Western world. Slim, elegant, impossibly graceful, with a neck that fashion photographers described as the most beautiful in Hollywood, with a body that Givenchy would dress and the world would imitate, with a quality that no other actress of her generation quite managed to replicate, a specific, luminous stillness that made the camera love her in ways that even the people behind the camera struggled to explain. They called it natural beauty. They called it effortless. They called her the third greatest female screen legend in Hollywood history. What they did not call it, what the fashion magazines and the film studios and the culture that consumed Audrey Hepburn for 4 decades never fully reckoned with, was what it actually was. The body that the world called perfect was a body that had been shaped by starvation. The thinness that Givenchy dressed was not a choice. It was what the Hunger Winter had left behind. And the woman who moved through the world with that specific, careful stillness, who never raised her voice, who chose her words with a precision that people took for elegance, was a woman who had learned in a cellar in Velp at 15 years old that the world was capable of things that you did not recover from fully. You carried them, and you kept going. I am Mary. And today we are not going to talk about the elegance. We are going to talk about what the elegance was covering. The starvation. The father who met Hitler and then abandoned his daughter. The 4 miscarriages. The 2 marriages to men who could not love her the way she needed to be loved. The cancer that grew in the same body the Hunger Winter had damaged, and that she refused to let stop her from traveling to Somalia to sit with starving children until 3 weeks before she died. The real Audrey Hepburn. Stay with me. Before the Hunger Winter, before Velp and the tulip bulbs and the swollen joints, there was a 6-year-old girl in Brussels who watched her father walk out the front door. He was a banker. He was also a Nazi sympathizer who had met Hitler personally. He abandoned his daughter completely. And what that abandonment did to Audrey Hepburn, the specific, documented way it shaped every relationship she would ever have with every man who came after him, is the most important thing in this entire story. That is where we begin. Audrey Kathleen Ruston was born on May 4th, 1929, in Ixelles, Brussels, Belgium. Her mother was Ella van Heemstra, a Dutch baroness, the daughter of a baron who had served as mayor of Arnhem and governor of Dutch Guiana, old European aristocracy. The kind of family whose name carried specific weight in the specific rooms where such names mattered. Her father was Joseph Victor Anthony Ruston, an English banker, ambitious, charming in the way of men who have decided that charm is a tool rather than a quality. He believed, without documentation to support the claim, without any genealogical evidence that has ever been verified, that he was descended from James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, the fourth husband of Mary, Queen of Scots. He eventually changed the family name to Hepburn Ruston on the strength of this belief. It was not the last time Joseph Ruston would construct a version of himself that the facts did not support. In 1935, Audrey was 6 years old. Her parents took her to Germany. They travelled with members of the British Union of Fascists. They attended Nazi Party events. They met Adolf Hitler privately in Munich. Her mother came back from that trip and wrote enthusiastic accounts of what she had witnessed for a British fascist publication called The Black Shirt. Her father came back and continued his involvement with the British Union of Fascists, involvement that would eventually put him under surveillance by British intelligence, who suspected him of receiving seed money from Germans with direct ties to Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. In 1935, the same year they went to Germany, the same year they met Hitler, Joseph Ruston walked out. He left his wife. He left his daughter. He left without explanation adequate to what he was doing, which was abandoning a 6-year-old girl who, by every account that exists from people who knew Audrey Hepburn across her entire life, worshipped him. She described it herself. She said she had worshipped her father and missed him terribly from the day he disappeared. She said her mother had great love for her, but was not always able to show it. She said the loss of her father was the great wound of her childhood, the one that did not close, that influenced every relationship she would have with every man who came after him, that produced in her a specific hunger for love and reassurance, and the presence of someone who would simply stay. He did not stay. He moved to England. He remarried. He became increasingly involved with fascist politics, to the point where, when the Second World War began, the British government arrested him and interned him as an enemy of the state under Defence Regulation 18B, imprisoned, specifically, for his membership in the British Union of Fascists and his associations with foreign fascists. He spent the war in prison. His daughter spent the war in occupied Netherlands. And here is the specific, documented detail that the elegant Audrey Hepburn mythology has never fully absorbed. Decades later, in the early 1960s, when Audrey Hepburn was one of the most famous women in the world, she tracked down her father with the help of the Red Cross. He was living in Dublin, Ireland. She arranged a meeting at the Shelbourne Hotel in 1964. She walked in. He saw her. He did not move toward her. She crossed the room and hugged him. She soon realized that the man she had spent her entire life missing was distant, emotionally detached, unable or unwilling to give her what she had crossed the room hoping for. They did not speak again for 20 years. And yet, and this is the detail that tells you everything about who Audrey Hepburn was, she continued to support him financially. The woman who had eaten tulip bulbs in a cellar in Velp while her father sat in a British internment camp and then a Dublin apartment sent him money until he died. In Baggot Street Hospital in Dublin in 1980, at the age of 91, she did not attend his funeral, but she had paid his bills. After the divorce, after Joseph Ruston walked out in 1935, Ella van Heemstra made a decision that she believed was the right one for her daughter. She sent Audrey to boarding school in Kent, England. Audrey was 6 years old. She spent 3 years there learning English, learning discipline, learning the specific, managed composure of a girl who has been placed in an institution and understands that the people who placed her there are not coming back immediately. She studied. She was, by accounts from that period, a quiet, serious child, one who did not cause problems, one who absorbed what was required of her and performed it back without visible complaint. She was learning something that would serve her for the rest of her life. How to be still when the world around her was not. In 1939, Audrey was 10 years old. Her mother made another decision. Germany was preparing to invade Poland. War was coming. And Ella van Heemstra, the Dutch baroness, who had written approvingly of Hitler in fascist publications 4 years earlier, who had attended Nazi rallies and socialized with people who would within months be running a military occupation of half of Europe, decided that the Netherlands would be safer than England. She brought Audrey home to Arnhem. The Germans invaded the Netherlands in May 1940. Arnhem, the city where Ella's father had been mayor, where the Van Heemstra family had estates and standing, and the specific, comfortable assumptions of old European aristocracy, became a primary German base of operations. Audrey was 11 years old, and what she saw in the years that followed was not something that 11-year-old girls are supposed to see. She watched Jewish neighbors loaded into train cars. She stood on the street and watched the deportations happen and understood with the specific, terrible clarity of a child who is seeing something that adults around her cannot adequately explain what the trains meant and where they were going. She was close to Anne Frank's age. They were born 5 months apart in 1929. Audrey survived. Anne Frank did not. Audrey would describe Anne Frank in later life as a soul sister. She believed she felt survivors' guilt, the specific, permanent weight of having made it when someone so similar to you did not. Her uncle, her mother's brother, was executed by the Germans in retaliation for resistance activities. One of her brothers was taken to Germany and forced into a labor camp. Another hid for the duration of the war. The Van Heemstra family properties, the estates, the assets, the specific material wealth of 3 generations of Dutch aristocracy were confiscated, damaged, destroyed. And Audrey, who had been brought back to the Netherlands for safety, was now inside the occupation. She kept dancing. This is the detail that everyone who tells the story of Audrey Hepburn's wartime years eventually arrives at, and it is real, it is documented, and it matters more than most tellings acknowledge. She had been studying ballet at the Arnhem Conservatory. She was serious about it, more serious than her age suggested, with the specific, disciplined dedication of a child who has found the one thing that makes sense of everything else. When the occupation began, she kept studying. And then someone noticed. A local resistance leader named Hendrik Wissert Hooft identified in the serious young dancer something useful, something that could be put to work. She began performing at what the Dutch called zwarte avonden, black evenings, underground concerts held in private homes behind blacked-out windows with guards posted outside to watch for German patrols. The performances were by invitation only. The audiences arrived in silence and left in silence. The money raised went to support Dutch Jews in hiding and to fund resistance activities. She danced. She also carried messages. She would stuff resistance newspapers into her shoes and ride her bicycle across Arnhem, past German checkpoints, past soldiers who might stop her. Her age was useful. She was young enough and slight enough that the patrols tended not to look too closely. She appeared innocuous. She had learned already, in the years since her father left, how to present a surface that did not reveal what was underneath. On one occasion, she was tasked with delivering food and information to a British paratrooper hiding in the countryside near Velp. German soldiers approached as she was making the delivery. She stopped. She picked flowers from the side of the road. She stood there, a 15-year-old girl picking flowers, while soldiers walked past her. They kept walking. She delivered what she was carrying. She said later that she was terrified every time, that the fear was real and constant, and did not diminish with repetition. But she kept going, because the alternative was to stop. And stopping, she had learnt this at 6 years old in Brussels, when a man walked out of a door and did not come back, was not something she was willing to do. Then the hunger winter came. In September 1944, the Allies launched Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne operation in history, an attempt to cross the Rhine at Arnhem and open a path into Germany that would end the war by Christmas. It failed. The Germans held the bridge. The paratroopers who had dropped into the fields around Arnhem were killed or captured in their thousands. And in retaliation for the Dutch railway strike that had been called to support the Allied operation, the Germans cut off food supplies to the Western Netherlands entirely. What followed was documented by medical researchers who studied it for decades afterward. The Dutch hunger winter of 1944 to 1945 killed between 18,000 and 22,000 people. Starvation rations fell to 500 calories per day, less than a third of what a child needs to develop normally. People ate grass, they ate leather, They ground tulip bulbs into flour and made something that resembled bread. They walked for days into the countryside, looking for anything that could be eaten. Audrey was 15 years old. By April 1945, when the Canadian forces finally rolled through Velp and the guns stopped and the smell of cigarette smoke drifted down from the soldiers in the street above the cellar where Audrey and her family had been. Hiding, she was severely malnourished, unable to sit properly, joints swollen with edema, eyes sunken, a body that had been in the process of consuming itself for months. When the Canadian soldiers found her, she was so elated that she asked them for a cigarette. She coughed on her first puff. She would smoke for the rest of her life. She later said that from that moment on, she associated smoking with liberation, with the specific embodied relief of a moment she had not been certain would come. The Allies brought food. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the organization that would eventually become UNICEF, sent supplies, medical care, calories, the specific, material form of the world, deciding that people who had been starving deserved to eat. Audrey Hepburn received that food. She was 15 years old. She never forgot it. And the woman who would eventually spend the last 5 years of her life traveling to Ethiopia and Somalia and Bangladesh and Sudan for UNICEF, who would sit with starving children in conditions that her son described as hell on earth, who would address the United States Congress on behalf of children who had no one else to address it for them, was already being made in that spring of 1945, in Velp, in the moment when strangers brought her food. When someone finally came, she survived the hunger winter. She left the Netherlands with a body that would never fully recover from what had been done to it, the anemia, the respiratory problems, the lifelong fragility that she would spend the rest of her life managing quietly, without complaint, without ever fully explaining to the world what the thinness it called beautiful actually was. What happened when she arrived in London, what she was told about her body, what ballet told her she could not do, and the specific moment in Monaco in 1953, filming in a street, when an elderly French author looked at her and decided she was exactly what she had been looking for, that changed everything. That is coming. She arrived in London in 1948. She was 18 years old. She had survived 5 years of Nazi occupation and 1 winter of starvation that had left permanent damage in her body, damage that the medical literature on the Dutch hunger winter would spend decades documenting. Anemia, respiratory problems, the specific systemic fragility of a body that had been deprived of adequate nutrition during the years when it was supposed to be developing into its adult form. She wanted to be a ballerina. She had been studying ballet since she was a child. It was the thing in the cellar in Velp, in the underground concerts, in the years when merely existing was the primary activity that had kept her connected to something larger than survival. The discipline of it, the specific, demanding beauty of a form that required everything you had and gave back something that felt like meaning. She went to Marie Rambert, one of the most respected ballet teachers in London. Rambert looked at her and told her the truth. She was too tall, 5 feet 7 inches, a height that the classical ballet world of 1948 could not accommodate in a principal dancer. The roles, the partnering, the specific physical requirements of the form she had devoted herself to, they required a shorter body. And there was something else. The malnutrition had taken something that training could not give back. The physical stamina required of a professional ballerina, the endurance, the sustained power, the ability to perform at that level night after night, was something that her body, damaged by the hunger winter at its most formative stage, could not fully produce. She was too tall and not strong enough, not because she had not worked hard enough. Because the Germans had cut off food supplies to the Western Netherlands in the winter of 1944, Rambert was kind about it. She told Audrey she had genuine talent. She encouraged her to continue studying. But the message was clear. The thing she had held on to through the occupation, through the Zwarte Avonden and the resistance newspapers in her shoes and the cellar in Velp, was not going to be her life. She was 18 years old. She adapted, because adapting was what she had learned to do. She began working as a chorus girl in West End musical productions, small parts, background work, the specific, unglamorous entry point into professional performance that most people who eventually become icons pass through without the world noticing. She modeled, she took acting classes, she auditioned. She made herself available to every opportunity that presented itself, with the same quiet, disciplined persistence that had kept her on a bicycle in Arnhem with Resistance newspapers in her shoes. And she was noticed. Not immediately, not dramatically. In the specific, gradual way that genuine talent tends to be noticed when it is accompanied by the willingness to show up consistently. She appeared in small film roles. She was cast in a West End revue. She was becoming, in the quiet, unannounced way of things, that are building toward something. Someone that the people who paid attention to such things were beginning to pay attention to. And then in 1951, Audrey was 21 years old. Something happened that accelerated everything. She was filming in Monte Carlo. An elderly French author named Colette was sitting in the lobby of her hotel. She looked up. She saw Audrey Hepburn walk across the lobby, and she said immediately, with the specific, total certainty of someone who has been looking for something for a long time and has just found it, that this was Gigi. Colette had written a novella called Gigi. It was being adapted for the Broadway stage, and the woman who had written it had been searching, apparently without success, for the actress who could embody the character. She had found her in a hotel lobby in Monaco. Audrey Hepburn sailed to New York. She rehearsed. She opened on Broadway in November 1951. The reviews were not mixed, not qualified, not the cautious praise of critics who are uncertain what they are watching. They were extraordinary. She was 21 years old, and she had never had a leading role before. What happened next happened very quickly. While she was performing in Gigi on Broadway, while the reviews were still reverberating, while the audiences were still lining up, she was flown to Rome to film a movie. The director was William Wyler. The male lead was Gregory Peck. The film was Roman Holiday. She played a princess who escapes her royal obligations for a single day in Rome and falls in love with an American journalist. The role required her to be simultaneously regal and unguarded, formal and spontaneous, the product of a world of protocol and a young woman who simply wants to be free of it for one afternoon. She understood that character completely. Roman Holiday was released in 1953. The response was not the response of a world discovering a new actress. It was the response of a world discovering something it had not known, it was missing and now could not imagine being without. She received the Academy Award for Best Actress. She was 23 years old. 3 days after she won the Oscar, she won the Tony Award for Best Actress for Gigi. Oscar and Tony in the same week. She was 23 years old, and she was now permanently, irrevocably, in the specific way that certain careers happen all at once and then simply continue to be Audrey Hepburn. Now here is the thing about what happened to Audrey Hepburn's body in the years that followed the Oscar. The world looked at her and called it perfect. The thinness that the Hunger Winter had produced, the specific, particular quality of her frame, the way she moved, the neck that photographers obsessed over, the quality that Givenchy would dress for the next 4 decades and call the ideal. The world received all of it as aesthetic, as choice, as the embodiment of a new kind of beauty that was departing from the bosomy blonde Hollywood standard of the 1950s and offering something more refined, more European, more the word people used, over and over, with a consistency that tells you something more elegant. It was not elegant. It was what starvation looks like when enough time has passed that the world has stopped connecting it to its cause. Audrey Hepburn knew this. She knew it because she lived in that body. Because the anemia that the Hunger Winter had produced never fully resolved. Because the respiratory problems stayed with her. Because the fragility that Rambert had identified, the inability to sustain the physical demands of a professional ballerina, expressed itself in other ways throughout her life. In ways that she managed quietly and without complaint, and without ever explaining to the world what she was actually managing. She was asked about her weight constantly, by journalists, by photographers, by the studio system that had given her an Oscar and now had opinions about the body that had won it. She did not eat much. She did not discuss why. She accepted the compliments about her figure with the specific grace of someone who has decided that the full explanation is not something the room is equipped to receive. She kept going, because keeping going was the only thing she had ever been taught to do. In 1953, the same year as Roman Holiday, the same year as the Oscar Audrey Hepburn met Mel Ferrer, at a party hosted by Gregory Peck, her Roman Holiday co-star, the man who had lobbied for her to be cast in the film in the first place, who had looked at a relatively unknown 22-year-old Belgian-Dutch actress and told William Wyler she was the only person who could play the princess. Mel Ferrer was an actor and director. He was 12 years older than Audrey. He had been married 3 times before. He had 4 children from previous relationships. He was serious and intense, and he paid her the specific, focused attention of a man who had decided he was interested. She was captivated, immediately, completely, with the specific, total investment of a woman whose foundational experience of love was a father who had walked out of a door when she was 6 years old and had not come back. A woman for whom the presence of a man who was paying attention was something she could not be entirely rational about. They began working together. She was cast in the Broadway play Ondine. He was her co-star. The on-stage chemistry was real, and the off-stage chemistry was more real, and by the time Ondine closed in July 1954, they were in love. They married on September 25th, 1954, in a small ceremony in Switzerland. She was 25 years old. She was the most famous actress in the world, and she was deeply, completely, somewhat dangerously happy. The happiness did not last in the form she had imagined it would. Mel Ferrer was not a bad man, not in the simple, clean way that the stories that came out about their marriage in the years after the divorce sometimes suggested. But he was a complicated one. And the complication that mattered most, the one that the director Alfred Lunt identified, and that Ferrer's own behavior documented, was control. He had opinions about her career. Specific, frequently expressed opinions about which roles she should take, which directors she should work with, which opportunities were appropriate for a woman of her stature and which were not. He was the older, more experienced partner. He positioned himself as the one who understood the industry better, who could see things she could not see from inside the specific, consuming fame that had descended on her at 23. She listened. Because she had spent her life listening to people who told her what she could not do. Rambert had told her she could not be a ballerina. The hunger winter had told her she could not be adequately nourished. Her father had told her, not in words, but in the most complete language available to a parent, that she was not worth staying for. She had learned to absorb those things and continue. But what Mel Ferrer was doing was different. Because what Mel Ferrer was doing was happening inside a marriage, inside the one relationship that was supposed to be the safe place, the place where the armor came off. And the armor could not come off. Because the armor was necessary. She wanted children. This is the thing that every person who knew Audrey Hepburn during her marriage to Mel Ferrer described as the central fact of her emotional life in those years. She wanted a family. She had grown up without a father. She had spent years moving between countries, between schools, between the specific instabilities of a childhood shaped by war and abandonment. She wanted to build something that stayed. In March 1955, 8 months after the wedding, she had her first miscarriage. She grieved it privately. She kept working. In 1959, she was filming The Unforgiven in Mexico. She fell from a horse onto a rock and broke her back. She was hospitalized. She recovered. And then she had another miscarriage, a stillbirth at 6 months, induced by the physical and mental trauma of the accident and the recovery. 2 pregnancies lost. She told almost no one the full extent of what she was experiencing. She appeared at events, completed her commitments, gave interviews in which she spoke warmly about her marriage and her hope for a family. She performed the role that the world expected of Audrey Hepburn, gracious, composed, luminous, while privately she was processing losses that she did not have adequate language for and did not feel she had permission to name publicly. She said once, and this is the line that has stayed with me since I first read it, that being pregnant was the happiest she had ever felt, that the specific physical reality of carrying a life was something that reached past every other consideration and simply made her feel present in a way nothing else did. She lost those pregnancies and kept going. In 1960, finally, after 5 years of marriage and 2 lost pregnancies, she gave birth to a son. Audrey Hepburn Ferrer. She wrote to a friend afterward, "Sean is truly a dream, and I find it hard to believe he is really ours to keep." Ours to keep. The specific language of a woman who had learned very early that the things you love do not always stay. The marriage to Mel Ferrer ended in 1968. After 14 years, after the control and the career opinions and the affairs his, documented. Hers, a response to his, also documented, and the specific, accumulating damage of 2 people who had not been able to give each other what the other needed. Their son Sean said later that from a young age, he had been aware that something between his parents just wasn't quite right. Audrey said that she had tried and tried, that she knew how difficult it had to be married to a world celebrity, that she was deeply disappointed. She was 38 years old. She had an Oscar and a Tony and a BAFTA and a Golden Globe and the most recognizable face in the world. She had 1 son. She had eaten tulip bulbs in a cellar in Velp at 15, and she was beginning to understand slowly, at the cost of 14 years of trying, that the hunger she had been carrying since a 6-year-old girl watched her father walk out of a door was not something that a marriage, however earnest, could fully feed. She would try again, once more, and the second time would be different, not better exactly, but different in ways that the first had not prepared her for. After Mel Ferrer, after the 14 years and the miscarriages and the control and the specific, documented failure of a marriage that had started with genuine love and ended with genuine damage, Audrey Hepburn made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She retired from acting. Completely. She married an Italian psychiatrist she had met on a cruise. She moved to Rome. She wanted, more than anything she had ever wanted, a quiet life. What happened instead? The affairs her second husband conducted openly while she stayed, and the moment she finally stopped trying to hold together something that was not working is coming. And what she did after she stopped trying is the most important part of this entire story. In January 1969, 4 months after her divorce from Mel Ferrer was finalized, Audrey Hepburn married Andrea Dotti. She had met him on a cruise the previous year. He was an Italian psychiatrist, 30 years old, charming, warm in the specific, uncomplicated way of a man who has not yet had the opportunity to disappoint you. He loved her. That part was real and documented, and not in dispute by anyone who knew them in those early years. She was 39 years old. She was done with Hollywood. She had said so publicly, and she meant it privately. This was not a performance of retirement, not the managed withdrawal of a celebrity calculating the right moment to return. She genuinely wanted out. She wanted Rome and a quiet apartment, and a husband who came home for dinner and children, and the specific, ordinary texture of a life that was not lived in front of cameras. She wanted what the 6-year-old girl in Brussels had wanted when her father walked out, a family that stayed. She moved to Rome. She reduced her public appearances to almost nothing. In February 1970, she was 40 years old. She gave birth to her second son, Luca Dotti. She was 40 years old, and she had her second child, and she was, by the accounts of people who saw her during those early Roman years, the happiest she had been since Sean was born. She cooked, she gardened, she walked her dogs, she always had dogs, throughout her entire life, with the specific, unconditional love for animals that people who have been let down by humans sometimes develop. She read. She attended Luca's school events and Sean's visits, and the specific, unglamorous, completely sustaining routines of a woman who had decided that this was what she wanted and was genuinely getting it. And then Andrea Dotti began having affairs, not discreetly, not in the managed, concealed way of a man who understands what is at stake, openly, with younger women, actresses, models, The specific, Italian tabloid photographed indiscretions of a man who was, as he himself later admitted, and this is his word, not an accusation, not an angel. She knew. Of course she knew. She had grown up watching Rose Kennedy at dinner with Gloria Swanson. No, that was someone else's story. But she had grown up watching her own mother absorb her father's choices. She had spent 14 years inside a marriage where she had absorbed more than she should have. She understood the specific female curriculum of looking the other way when looking away was the only option that preserved what you had built. She looked away for a while. In 1974, she suffered another miscarriage, her fourth, the last one. Her doctors advised that at 44 years old, another pregnancy was not medically advisable. The family she had wanted, the large, full, staid family, was not going to be larger than it was. She had Sean, she had Luca, she had Rome and dogs, and a husband who was, increasingly, somewhere else. In 1980, after 11 years of marriage, after the affairs that had become impossible to ignore, and the specific, accumulating damage of a woman who kept trying to hold together something that was not working, she met Robert Wolders. He was Dutch, a widower, a man who had recently lost his wife and who was, in the specific language of two people who have both survived things they did not expect to survive, ready for something genuine. She fell in love with him immediately. Not the consuming, slightly dangerous love she had felt for Mel Ferrer, not the hopeful, wanting love she had felt for Andrea Dotti. Something quieter, more founded. The love of a woman who has finally arrived somewhere after a very long journey and recognizes the place as the one she was looking for. She divorced Dotti in 1982. She and Robert Wolders never married. They both decided, separately and then together, that what they had was working exactly as it was. Why mess with a good thing? She said. What they had was enough, more than enough. She was 52 years old. She had found the person who would stay, and now freed from the specific, consuming work of managing marriages that were not working, freed from the performances she had been giving in private for 40 years, she could finally do the thing she had been circling her entire life. She went back to work, not to Hollywood, not to film sets and publicity campaigns, and the managed celebrity of an actress maintaining her image. She went to Ethiopia. In 1988, Audrey Hepburn was appointed a Goodwill Ambassador for UNICEF. She was 58 years old. Her first field mission was to Mekelle, the capital of the Tigray region of Ethiopia. There was a famine. There had been a famine for years. The world knew about it in the abstract, statistical way that the world knows about suffering that is happening somewhere else, in numbers, in reports, in the occasional news segment that runs between other things and then is replaced by other things. Audrey Hepburn walked into an orphanage in Mekelle. There were 500 starving children. She had been one of those children, not in Ethiopia, not in an orphanage, but in a cellar in Velp in the winter of 1944, with swollen joints and sunken eyes, eating tulip bulb flower. She had been exactly that hungry. She had felt exactly that specific abandonment by the world, the specific, terrible understanding that the systems that were supposed to protect you had decided that your survival was not their priority. And then the strangers had come with food, the strangers who became UNICEF. She stood in that orphanage in Mekelle in 1988, and she understood with a clarity that no amount of Hollywood fame or celebrity philanthropy had ever produced exactly why she was there. She had been given food when she was starving. She was here to give it back, she told the press afterward, in language that was careful and precise and completely without sentimentality, what she had seen. She said she had seen mothers and children who had walked for 10 days looking for food. She said she had seen people settling onto the desert floor into makeshift camps where they might die. She said the image was too much for her. She went back. Again and again. Turkey, Ecuador, Honduras, Sudan, Bangladesh, Somalia, Guatemala, El Salvador, Vietnam, Mexico. Venezuela. In 5 years as a UNICEF ambassador, she visited more than 50 countries. She addressed the United States Congress. She spoke at the United Nations. She sat on the desert floor with dying children and held them and spoke about them afterward, with a specificity and a moral weight that made the people listening feel that they had no excuse not to do something. She was 58 years old, then 59, then 60, then 61, then 62. She did not stop. Robert Wolders travelled with her on every mission. He watched her, his woman, the one he had found after they had both survived, things they had not expected to survive. Walk into the worst places on earth and sit with the people in them and come back. Changed every time. Changed and more determined. As if each mission was simultaneously costing her something and giving her something that nothing else in her life had given her with the same completeness. She had said once years earlier, in an interview that most people had not paid sufficient attention to, that she could testify to what UNICEF meant to children, because she had been among those who received food and medical relief after World War II. This was not a talking point. This was the truth. She was not a celebrity who had adopted a cause. She was a survivor who was paying a debt. In 1992, Audrey was 62 years old. She went to Somalia. Somalia in 1992 was, by multiple accounts from the journalists and aid workers who were there, one of the most devastating humanitarian situations on earth. Civil war, famine, the complete collapse of institutional infrastructure, children dying at a rate that the numbers could not adequately convey. Her son Sean, who had watched his mother travel to difficult places for 4 years and had always been frightened for her, always been the person at home waiting for the call that she had landed safely, described what she came back from Somalia looking like. He said she had witnessed hell on earth. She had lost weight. She was pale, the specific, luminous quality that had made photographers love her, that had sold millions of magazine covers, that Givenchy had dressed for 4 decades, was present but diminished, as if what she had seen had taken something that she was not going to be able to get back. She gave a press conference when she returned. She described what she had seen with the specific, controlled precision she always used in public, the precision that had started as a survival mechanism in a cellar in Velp and had become, over 62 years of living, simply the way she spoke. She called on governments. She called on individuals. She said that the world could not look at what was happening in Somalia and call itself unable to act. She was exhausted. She was in pain. A few weeks after she returned from Somalia, she went to her doctors with abdominal pain that had been building for several months. The diagnosis was pseudomyxoma peritoneae, an extremely rare cancer of the appendix, mucus-producing cancer cells that had been slowly accumulating inside her abdomen. The same family of cancers as colon cancer. Researchers would later document that women who had experienced severe caloric restriction in childhood as the survivors of the Dutch hunger winter had showed increased risk of colon cancer as adults. The hunger winter. Still, after 47 years, still taking something, she underwent surgery in November 1992. She came home to Switzerland, to her house in Tolochenaz, to her garden and her dogs, and Robert Wolders, who had travelled every mile of the last 12 years with her and was not going anywhere now. She was in pain. She was declining. The surgery had not been able to remove everything. She was 63 years old, and she kept working. In December 1992, a month after the surgery, weeks before she died, she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President George H.W. Bush, the highest civilian honor in the United States. Awarded in recognition of her work as a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, she accepted it. She kept going, because keeping going was the only thing she had ever been taught to do. She died on January 20th, 1993, in her sleep. at home in Switzerland, with Robert Wolders beside her and her garden outside the window and her sons on their way. The morning after she died, her PBS documentary series about gardens premiered on television. She had filmed it the previous year. The world watched her walk through gardens in 7 countries, alive and luminous, and talking about flowers. The morning after she was gone, what she left behind. What the starvation body that the world called perfect actually produced. And the one thing she said about her life, in her own words, that changes how you read every photograph of her that has ever been taken. That is the last part. On January 20th, 1993, Audrey Hepburn died in her sleep. She was at home in Tolochenaz, Switzerland. Robert Wolders was beside her. Her garden was outside the window, the garden she had tended with the specific, devoted attention of someone who understands what it means to watch something grow. Her sons were on their way. She was 63 years old. The following morning, January 21st, 1993, the day after she died, her PBS documentary series, Gardens of the World, with Audrey Hepburn, premiered on American television. The world turned on their televisions and watched her walk through gardens in 7 countries, alive, luminous, speaking about flowers with the specific, quiet enthusiasm of a woman who had found in growing things a peace that the rest of her life had not always been able to provide. She had filmed it the year before. She had been diagnosed with cancer between the filming and the premiere. She never saw it air. The world watched her the morning after she was gone. Now, here is what I want to say about the life of Audrey Hepburn. Not the myth, not the elegance, not the Givenchy and the pearls and the cigarette holder and the specific beautiful surface that the world consumed for 4 decades and called perfect. The real one. 2 hands. Here is what I take from the life of Audrey Hepburn. The world looked at her and saw elegance. The Dutch royal family sent flowers. Elizabeth Taylor sent flowers. The world mourned the elegance. I want you to remember the tulip bulbs. I Am Mary. The full story of what the war did to the women who survived it continues. And next, the woman who shared Audrey Hepburn's world in a different way entirely. Who performed for the same cameras, in the same era, under the same pressures, and who paid a completely different price. That story is coming. I will see you there.